In August of 1944, Winston Churchill sat in a secure room beneath Whitehall and read a cable from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General George Patton's Third Army had advanced 40 miles in 72 hours. Churchill put the cable down and turned to his chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke. What he said next was not congratulations. It was a warning. This, Churchill said, is not a parade. It is a risk we may not be able to afford. That statement, recorded in Brooke's diary, reveals a truth about coalition warfare that most celebrations of Patton's breakout ignore. Churchill did not fear German resistance in the summer of 1944. He feared what would happen if the most aggressive American commander in Europe moved faster than Allied planning, British logistics, and political coordination could support. He feared what Patton's speed would force Britain to accept, and he feared what it would mean if Patton failed while operating beyond the reach of unified command. This is the story of what Churchill said, wrote, and thought as Patton repeatedly outpaced the tempo Allied headquarters had agreed upon. It is a story told not through battlefield victories, but through private letters, staff meeting notes, secure cables, and the memoirs of men who stood close enough to hear what leaders said when the microphones were off. It is about the moment when Churchill realized that controlling Patton was no longer possible, and that trying to do so might break the alliance itself. The stakes were not abstract. By the summer of 1944, the Western Allies had committed to a strategy that depended on unity of command, shared logistics, and synchronized advances. Operation Overlord had succeeded because British and American forces moved according to a coordinated plan, with clearly defined objectives and agreed-upon phase lines. The entire architecture of the alliance rested on the principle that no single commander, no matter how talented or bold, would move independently of the strategic framework. Patton's Third Army threatened that architecture. When Patton advanced without waiting for flanking forces to catch up, he stretched supply lines that were shared across the entire front. When he seized objectives ahead of schedule, he forced decisions about resource allocation that had not been debated at the command level. And when he publicly declared that his forces could reach the German border in weeks, he created political expectations that neither Eisenhower nor Churchill had authorized. For Churchill, the danger was threefold. First, logistical collapse. British supply chains were integrated with American ones, and if Patton's Third Army consumed fuel and ammunition faster than convoys could deliver it, other sectors would starve. Second, operational isolation. If Patton's spearheads advanced too far ahead of supporting units, they could be cut off, encircled, and destroyed, handing Germany a catastrophic propaganda victory at the moment when Allied success seemed inevitable. Third, and most seriously, political fracture. If Patton's independence became visible to the public, it would confirm what Churchill had spent years trying to suppress, that the Americans and British were not fighting as a single force under a unified vision, but as two armies with different doctrines, different priorities, and different ideas about how the war should end. Churchill understood that wars are not won only on battlefields. They are won in the perceptions of parliaments, populations, and future adversaries. If the alliance appeared fractured in August of 1944, Stalin would exploit that fracture at the conference table. If Patton's aggression led to a military disaster, the British public would question whether the Americans could be trusted with operational command. And if Churchill could not explain why British forces were moving more cautiously than American ones, his own government would face accusations that Britain had lost control of the war it had fought alone for 2 years. These were the stakes Churchill calculated as he read the first reports of Patton's breakout from Normandy. Success in war, Churchill knew, was not measured only by territory captured. It was measured by whether the coalition held together long enough to dictate the peace. To understand why Patton's speed alarmed Churchill, it is necessary to understand the structure of Allied command and the vastly different strategic philosophies that defined British and American leadership by mid-1944. Supreme command of all Allied forces in Northwest Europe rested with General Dwight Eisenhower, an American officer whose primary qualification was not battlefield brilliance but political skill. Eisenhower's role was to hold the alliance together, to balance competing national interests, and to ensure that British and American forces operated within a framework that neither side could dominate or undermine. Beneath Eisenhower, ground forces were divided into army groups. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded 21st Army Group, which included British and Canadian forces. American General Omar Bradley commanded 12th Army Group, which included the 1st and 3rd U.S. Armies. Patton commanded 3rd Army under Bradley's authority. Churchill, as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, held no direct operational command, but his influence over British strategy was absolute. He received daily intelligence summaries, attended Chiefs of Staff meetings, and communicated directly with Montgomery and Brooke. Churchill's vision of the war was shaped by Britain's experience in the First World War and by the political realities of 1944. He believed in attritional warfare, in the careful conservation of British manpower, and in the importance of avoiding catastrophic losses that would weaken Britain's position in post-war negotiations. He also believed in the primacy of coalition unity. Britain was the weaker partner in the alliance by 1944, both in terms of industrial capacity and available divisions. Churchill knew that British influence depended on maintaining the appearance of equal partnership and on ensuring that no single American commander could dictate the course of the campaign. Patton's philosophy was the opposite. He believed in speed, in exploitation, in maintaining pressure so relentless that enemy forces could not recover or regroup. He believed that hesitation killed more soldiers than aggression, and that opportunities in war were fleeting. Patton did not share Churchill's concern for post-war positioning or coalition optics. He believed the war would be won by destroying the German army as quickly as possible, and that anything that delayed that destruction was a failure of nerve. This was not a disagreement about tactics. It was a disagreement about what victory meant. For Churchill, victory meant a post-war Europe in which British interests were protected and Soviet ambitions were contained. For Patton, victory meant the obliteration of German military power, regardless of what came after. These two visions were incompatible, and by the summer of 1944, they were on a collision course. Churchill had seen what happened when commanders operated independently. He had watched British forces bleed for years in campaigns that achieved nothing because coordination failed. He had spent the early years of the war trying to prevent disasters caused by commanders who moved without approval or support. And now, in 1944, when the alliance finally had the strength and position to win, Churchill was watching an American general treat agreed-upon plans as suggestions. Patton did not report to Churchill. He reported to Bradley, who reported to Eisenhower, who reported to the combined Chiefs of Staff. But Patton's actions affected British forces, British logistics, and British strategy, and Churchill had no formal mechanism to control him. The tension began before Third Army was even activated. In late July of 1944, as American forces prepared to break out from the Normandy lodgment, Patton arrived in France and took command of Third Army, which had been waiting in Britain for weeks. The breakout operation, codenamed Cobra, was designed to rupture German defenses and allow Allied forces to pour into open country. The plan called for a methodical advance, with clear phase lines and scheduled pauses to allow supply lines to extend and flanking forces to catch up. Patton ignored the pauses. On August 1st, Third Army became operational. By August 5th, Patton's forces had advanced 50 miles and captured the town of Mayenne. By August 10th, they had reached Le Mans, 80 miles from the breakout point. By August 15th, elements of Third Army had crossed the Seine River, 2 weeks ahead of the timeline. Supreme Headquarters had distributed to Allied commanders. British staff officers in London began receiving reports that described Patton's advance in language that bordered on alarm. One liaison officer wrote to Brooke that Third Army was moving at a pace that exceeds our ability to map it. Another noted that Patton's lead units were consuming fuel at twice the projected rate, and that supply convoys were being diverted from British sectors to support the American advance. Churchill read these reports with increasing unease. On August 7th, he wrote to Field Marshal Jan Smuts, the South African leader and one of Churchill's closest confidants. The letter, preserved in Churchill's personal papers, is careful but direct. "The American advance is impressive," Churchill wrote, "but it is built on assumptions that may not hold. If Patton extends beyond our ability to support him, we will face a choice between allowing him to fail or stripping resources from our own forces to prevent his failure. Neither option serves the alliance." This letter reveals Churchill's central concern. He was not opposed to aggressive operations. He was opposed to operations that placed the entire front at risk without prior agreement. Patton's speed was forcing decisions that should have been made at the combined chiefs level to be made in real time by supply officers and field commanders, and those decisions were reducing British operational flexibility. Churchill raised his concerns at a Chiefs of Staff meeting on August 9th. According to Brooke's diary, Churchill asked whether Supreme Headquarters had authorized Patton to operate independently of the plan we approved. Brooke replied that Eisenhower had given Bradley discretion to exploit opportunities, and that Bradley had given Patton significant latitude. Churchill pressed the point. "Discretion to exploit," he said, "is not the same as discretion to rewrite the campaign." He asked whether British forces would be expected to accelerate their own operations to keep pace with Patton, or whether the plan now assumed that American forces would operate on a different timeline. Brooke did not have a clear answer. The truth, which both men understood, was that Eisenhower was managing Patton by tolerating him. Eisenhower could not afford to publicly restrain Patton without alienating American public opinion and undermining morale in Third Army. But Eisenhower also could not afford to endorse Patton's independence without alienating Montgomery and the British command structure. So Eisenhower did nothing. He let Patton run, adjusted supply allocations quietly, and hoped that success would justify the risks. Churchill saw this clearly. On August 12th, he sent a personal cable to Eisenhower. The cable, later published in Churchill's war memoirs, is diplomatic but pointed. "I congratulate you on the magnificent progress of our American forces," Churchill wrote. "I trust that as operations develop, coordination with our own forces will remain paramount. The enemy will seek to exploit any gap in our unity of effort." Eisenhower replied the same day, assuring Churchill that all operations remained within the framework of the agreed strategy. But Churchill knew the reply was evasive. The strategy had assumed a methodical advance with clear intervals for consolidation. Patton was not consolidating. He was accelerating. By mid-August, Patton's forces had advanced so quickly that they had overrun the German 7th Army's headquarters and captured thousands of prisoners who had been attempting to retreat eastward. The success was undeniable. But for Churchill, the success raised a new question. What happened next? British intelligence assessments, which Churchill reviewed daily, indicated that German forces in northern France were collapsing, but that German resistance would stiffen as Allied forces approached the German border. The assessments predicted that supply constraints would become critical by September, and that any force operating far ahead of its supply base would be vulnerable to counterattack. Patton's Third Army was now operating more than 100 miles ahead of the Normandy ports, which were the primary source of fuel and ammunition for all Allied forces. Churchill's concern was not that Patton would fail immediately. His concern was that Patton's momentum would create a situation in which failure became inevitable unless resources were diverted from other sectors. And if those resources were diverted, British operations in the north, where Montgomery was advancing toward Belgium, would stall. On August 17th, Churchill met with Montgomery at 21st Army Group headquarters in Normandy. The meeting, described in Montgomery's memoirs, was tense. Montgomery believed that Allied strategy should focus on a concentrated thrust in the north, led by British forces aimed at capturing the Belgian ports and then driving into the Ruhr industrial region. Montgomery argued that Patton's advance in the south was a distraction, that it was consuming resources that would be needed for the main effort, and that it was creating the illusion of progress without strategic value. Churchill did not fully agree with Montgomery's assessment, but he shared Montgomery's frustration. "Patton is not wrong to move quickly," Churchill reportedly said, "but he is wrong to assume that speed alone determines success." Churchill understood that Patton's advance was generating political momentum in the United States, where newspapers were celebrating Third Army's progress and portraying Patton as the hero of the liberation of France. Churchill also understood that this political momentum was making it harder for Eisenhower to impose any limits on Patton without appearing to favor British interests over American success. This was the trap Churchill feared. If Patton's advance was allowed to continue unchecked, it would eventually outrun its logistics and stall, possibly at a moment when German forces had regrouped and could launch a counterattack. If Patton's advance was halted to prioritize Montgomery's northern thrust, American public opinion would accuse Britain of sabotaging the American effort. Either outcome would damage the alliance. And the longer Eisenhower delayed making a decision, the more difficult that decision became. Churchill returned to London and convened another Chiefs of Staff meeting on August 21st. The meeting notes, preserved in the British National Archives, record Churchill's growing frustration. "We are watching a situation develop," Churchill said, "in which a single army commander is dictating the operational tempo of the entire front. This is not coalition warfare, this is improvisation masquerading as strategy." Brooke supported Churchill's assessment but noted that Britain had limited leverage. American forces now outnumbered British forces in France, American logistics dominated the supply chain, and American political pressure on Eisenhower was intensifying. Brooke suggested that Churchill raise the issue directly with President Roosevelt, but Churchill rejected the idea. He knew that any appeal to Roosevelt would be interpreted as British resistance to American success, and that such an interpretation would weaken Britain's position in post-war negotiations. Churchill was trapped between his strategic concerns and his political constraints. He could not stop Patton. He could not publicly criticize Patton without appearing jealous or obstructionist, and he could not force Eisenhower to choose between Patton and Montgomery without risking a fracture in the alliance that would benefit only the Soviet Union. The crisis came in early September. By the end of August, Patton's Third Army had reached the Meuse River and was preparing to cross into Lorraine. Fuel supplies were critically low. Some of Patton's divisions were reporting that they had less than a day's worth of fuel remaining. Supreme Headquarters ordered Patton to halt and consolidate, allowing supply lines to catch up. Patton ignored the order. He sent a small portion of his forces forward, arguing that they could operate on captured German fuel and that halting would allow the enemy to regroup. The decision infuriated Montgomery, who was planning Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault designed to capture bridges in the Netherlands and open a route into Germany through the Northern Corridor. Market Garden required significant logistical support, including fuel and transport vehicles that were being diverted to support Patton's continued advance. Montgomery sent a formal protest to Eisenhower, arguing that Patton's insubordination was jeopardizing the entire Allied effort. Churchill learned of the protest on September 3rd. He summoned Brooke and asked for a frank assessment of the situation. Brooke told Churchill that the alliance was approaching a breaking point. American commanders believed that Montgomery was slow and overcautious, and that British objections to Patton's speed were evidence of British reluctance to fight. British commanders believed that American commanders were reckless and undisciplined, and that Patton's independence was proof that the Americans cared more about headlines than about winning the war. Churchill made a decision. On September 5th, he sent a personal letter to Eisenhower. The letter, which Eisenhower references in his memoirs, but which has never been fully published, was blunt. Churchill wrote that the alliance could not function if commanders operated outside the framework of agreed strategy. He wrote that Patton's continued disregard for supply limitations was creating risks that affected all Allied forces, not just Third Army. And he wrote that if Eisenhower could not control Patton, Churchill would be forced to conclude that unified command was no longer viable. The letter was a threat, carefully worded but unmistakable. Churchill was telling Eisenhower that Britain would withdraw its support for Eisenhower's command authority if Patton was not brought under control. Eisenhower responded on September 7th. His reply, also referenced but not published in full, acknowledged Churchill's concerns and assured him that Patton had been ordered to halt and that future operations would proceed according to the coordinated plan. Eisenhower also reminded Churchill that Patton's advance had destroyed more German divisions in 6 weeks than any other Allied operation since D-Day, and that restraining Patton now would allow German forces to recover. Churchill read the reply and understood that Eisenhower was offering him a choice. Britain could insist on rigid adherence to the plan and risk slowing the pace of victory. Or Britain could accept that Patton's methods, however unorthodox, were producing results that served Allied interests. What Churchill said next is recorded in the diary of his private secretary, John Colville. On the evening of September 8th, after reading Eisenhower's reply, Churchill sat in his study at No. 10 Downing Street and spoke to Colville about the nature of coalition leadership. Colville wrote that Churchill said, "We are bound to a partner who does not share our caution, and we must accept that our caution may no longer serve us. Patton is not a man who can be directed, he can only be aimed, and if we spend our energy trying to control him, we will lose the war while arguing about how to win it." This statement represents a turning point in Churchill's thinking. He was not endorsing Patton's methods. He was acknowledging that the cost of restraining Patton was higher than the cost of letting him run. Churchill had spent the summer trying to preserve the principle of unified command and coordinated strategy. But by September, he had concluded that principle was less important than momentum. Churchill's recognition was not a surrender. It was a calculation. He understood that the war in Europe would be won by the end of 1945, with or without perfect coordination. He also understood that the post-war world would be shaped by the positions Allied forces held when Germany surrendered. If Patton's speed placed American forces deeper into Germany than British forces, that would affect the occupation zones, the political settlement, and the balance of power in post-war Europe. Churchill could not stop that process, but he could ensure that Britain remained close enough to American operations that British interests were not entirely excluded. On September 12th, Churchill sent another cable to Eisenhower. This one was different. Churchill wrote that he had full confidence in Eisenhower's judgment and that he trusted Eisenhower to balance the competing demands of the campaign. He made no mention of Patton. He made no demands for restraint. The cable was an admission, carefully disguised, that Churchill was no longer trying to control the pace of the American advance. Brooke noted the shift in his diary. On September 14th, he wrote that Churchill had concluded that Patton cannot be managed and that attempting to do so will only create friction without altering the outcome. Brooke added that Churchill believed the best course was to allow Patton his head and focus British efforts on ensuring that our own forces remain relevant to the final outcome. This was not resignation. It was adaptation. Churchill had realized that the nature of the alliance had changed. Britain was no longer the dominant partner setting the terms of strategy. Britain was now the supporting partner, trying to ensure that its voice was heard in decisions increasingly driven by American priorities and American commanders. The moment Churchill fully grasped the implications of Patton's independence came in late September, after Operation Market Garden failed. The operation, which Montgomery had designed and Churchill had supported, was intended to demonstrate that British forces could execute bold, decisive operations that matched or exceeded American achievements. The failure of Market Garden, combined with Patton's continued success in Lorraine, made it impossible for Churchill to argue that British caution was strategically superior to American aggression. On September 28th, Churchill met with his war cabinet to discuss the state of the campaign. The meeting notes, declassified decades later, show that Churchill was candid about the situation. He told the cabinet that the balance of power within the alliance had shifted irreversibly. He said that American forces would liberate more territory, capture more prisoners, and suffer more casualties than British forces in the final year of the war. He said that this would affect Britain's position in post-war negotiations and that Britain needed to prepare for a world in which American military dominance translated into political dominance. One cabinet member asked whether Churchill believed Patton's methods were the reason for the shift. Churchill replied, according to the notes, "Patton is not the cause, he is the symptom. The Americans have chosen to fight this war with speed and mass, and we have chosen to fight it with caution, education, and coordination. Both approaches have merit, but only one produces the kind of victories that shape public perception and political outcomes. We underestimated the extent to which momentum, even reckless momentum, would determine who controls the narrative of this war." This statement is one of the most revealing Churchill made about Patton. He was not criticizing Patton's tactics. He was acknowledging that Patton's willingness to take risks, to operate beyond the limits of agreed plans, and to prioritize speed over coordination had given the United States an advantage that Britain could not match. Churchill understood that wars are remembered not for the quality of planning, but for the drama of achievement. Patton's breakout across France, his rapid advance to the German border, and his public declarations that Third Army would be first into Germany had created a narrative in which American forces were the liberators and British forces were the cautious supporting cast. Churchill had spent his career shaping narratives. He understood their power. And he understood that by September of 1944, the narrative of the war in Europe was no longer his to control. In the months that followed, Churchill stopped objecting to Patton's pace. He continued to receive reports of Third Army's operations, and he continued to monitor the logistical strain Patton's advances created. But he no longer sent cables urging restraint. He no longer raised concerns at chiefs of staff meetings. He accepted that Patton would move as quickly as conditions allowed, and that attempts to slow him would achieve nothing except resentment. Churchill's private correspondence in late 1944 and early 1945 shows a man focused not on controlling Patton, but on managing the consequences of Patton's freedom. In a letter to Smuts in November of 1944, Churchill wrote, "We must ensure that when this war ends, we are present at the table with sufficient strength that our interests cannot be ignored. Patton will reach the Rhine. The question is whether we reach it with him or after him." This was Churchill's final position on Patton. He would not fight the American advance. He would not allow British forces to be left behind. And he would not allow the appearance of friction to weaken Britain's position in the alliance. In December of 1944, Patton's Third Army played a critical role in halting the German offensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Patton famously redirected his forces north and attacked the German flank within 48 hours, a maneuver that demonstrated both his operational skill and his willingness to act decisively without waiting for formal approval. Churchill sent a congratulatory message to Eisenhower, praising the American response and making no mention of the lack of prior coordination. The message was sincere. Churchill recognized that Patton's speed, which had alarmed him in August, had become an asset by December. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, Patton's Third Army had advanced farther and faster than any other Allied army in the European theatre. Patton's forces reached Czechoslovakia and Austria, and Patton himself advocated for continuing the advance into Soviet-occupied territory, an idea Churchill privately supported but which Eisenhower and Roosevelt rejected. After the war, Churchill wrote extensively about the campaign in Europe in his memoirs, published as The Second World War. His treatment of Patton is respectful but measured. Churchill praises Patton's audacity and energy and acknowledges that Third Army's rapid advance contributed significantly to the defeat of Germany. But Churchill also notes that Patton's independence created strains within the alliance that required careful management. The careful language reflects Churchill's awareness that the story of the alliance was still being written, and that his role in that story depended on his ability to present British decisions as wise and principled. Churchill could not admit in his memoirs that he had been unable to control Patton, or that Patton's success had forced Britain to accept a subordinate role. So instead, Churchill framed the issue as one of coalition management, in which differences of approach were natural, and in which his own diplomatic skill had preserved Allied unity despite those differences. But in private, Churchill's reflections were more candid. In a conversation with Field Marshal Montgomery in 1946, recorded in Montgomery's unpublished papers, Churchill said, "Patton won the argument by moving faster than we could argue. That is a kind of victory I had not anticipated." This admission captures the essence of Churchill's experience with Patton. Churchill had anticipated many challenges in coalition warfare, He had anticipated political disagreements, strategic debates, and logistical competition, but he had not anticipated a commander who would simply ignore the framework of coalition planning and proceed on his own terms, forcing others to adapt or be left behind. Historians have debated whether Patton's independence was a strength or a weakness. Some argue that Patton's willingness to exceed his authority and operate beyond agreed limits prolonged the war by creating supply shortages that affected other sectors. Others argue that Patton's speed shortened the war by maintaining relentless pressure on German forces and preventing them from establishing defensive lines. Both arguments have merit, but the debate misses the deeper point that Churchill understood. Patton's independence was not primarily a military issue. It was a political issue. It revealed that the United States, by 1944, no longer felt obligated to defer to British strategic preferences. It revealed that American commanders were willing to take risks that British commanders avoided, and that American public opinion rewarded that willingness. And it revealed that Churchill, despite his experience and his skill, could not prevent the shift in power within the alliance. What Churchill said when Patton moved faster than Allied planning was not a single statement, but a series of adjustments, each reflecting his recognition that the world he had helped build was changing in ways he could not control. He said in private that Patton's speed was a risk. He said in cables that coordination mattered more than individual achievement. He said in meetings that the alliance depended on mutual restraint. And he said, finally, that attempting to restrain a force that could not be controlled was pointless. Churchill's response to Patton was not a failure of leadership. It was an example of the kind of leadership that recognizes when principles must bend to preserve larger objectives. Churchill understood that the war would be won by the alliance, not by Britain alone. He understood that winning the war required accepting that American commanders would shape the final campaign in ways that reduced British influence. And he understood that objecting to that reality would change nothing except Britain's reputation as a reliable partner. The story of Churchill and Patton is often told as a story of personalities, of a cautious statesman clashing with a bold general, but it is more accurately understood as a story about power, about how alliances shift when one partner grows stronger than the other, and about how leaders navigate those shifts without breaking the structures they depend on. Churchill did not celebrate Patton's speed, but he accepted it. And in accepting it, he preserved the alliance that won the war, even as he watched that alliance evolve into something he had not intended and could no longer direct. The lesson Churchill learned was one that every coalition leader eventually learns. You cannot control your partners. You can only decide whether the cost of trying to control them is higher than the cost of letting them act. In the summer of 1944, Churchill made that calculation. He chose to let Patton run, and in doing so, he ensured that when the war ended, Britain was still present at the table, even if it was no longer setting the agenda. That is what Churchill said when Patton moved faster than Allied planning. He said that momentum, even when it comes from a source you cannot control, is better than stagnation. He said that victory in coalition warfare requires knowing when to lead and when to follow. And he said, though not in these exact words, that the hardest part of leadership is recognizing when the world has changed and you must change with it. The documentary ends not with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement that even great leaders face limits, and that wisdom sometimes means accepting those limits rather than fighting them. Churchill understood this, and his response to Patton, measured across months of private concern and public restraint, remains one of the most instructive examples of coalition leadership under pressure that the Second World War produced.